Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Sneed, the President and CEO of the Handel and Haydn Society, and I'm so excited about this conversation we're going to have today. A couple of housekeeping issues. One is we're recording today's session for future listeners, so you all know that, so we won't get busted now. And secondly, we want to make this interactive, and please use the Q&A feature if you want to ask any questions. We'll get to as many of those as we can in the course of the next hour. So in October, I read this review in the Boston Globe of a book called Mr. Beethoven. And it took as its premise, or sort of starting point, the fact that in 1823, H&H, which had been founded in 1815, offered a commission to Ludwig van Beethoven to write an oratorio for Boston. He was busy at the time with something called the Ninth Symphony, so he never got to it. And this book said, well, what if it happened? What would it have been like for Beethoven to come over, spend a summer in Boston, Quincy, write an oratorio, get to know the people here. And the result was this fantastic historical novel fantasy about what could have happened. In his review, Michael Patrick Brady said, "The result is a novel of great wit and empathy, one that provides a deep insight into the composition of both classical music and historical literature through playful, inventive prose." So I just had to read it, which I did. I bought it, loved it. And I'm thrilled to have with us today the author of Mr. Beethoven, Paul Griffiths. Paul is a Welsh novelist, librettist, music critic. He has worked as a critic for the Times of London, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. His other writings include 5 published novels, a dozen or so books on classical music, and several librettos. He lives and joins us today from the village of Manorbier, Wales. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much.
Hello, David.
Thank you for this book. Really. Also with us today, the author of the review, Michael Patrick Brady. Hi, Michael. Freelance writer, literary critic, who reviewed the book for the Globe and agreed to be our moderator. And also, hi, Teresa, H&H's historically informed performance fellow, Teresa Neff, and our historian. And so with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Michael, to lead the discussion. And please, those of you watching, don't forget to join us via the Q&A function. Over to you, Michael.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much, David, and thank you for having me here. Paul, I'm really excited to talk to you about what I consider to be a really fascinating and unique novel. I know David gave us a little summary of it, but in your words, can you provide a short description of what the book is and what you were trying to accomplish with it? I think he might be frozen, so we can just wait till he pops back in. Or he's being very still.
Sorry. I'm sorry, you're breaking up. And I should say the internet connection over here is very unstable. So I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Sure. I was just asking, I think David provided a nice high-level overview of the book. In your own words, for those in the audience who haven't yet read it or aren't aware of it, can you provide your own summary of the plot?
Okay, well, I got this idea because of knowing about the commission. Well, what if it had really what would it have taken for it to have really supplied? And then we look at how he might have got across to Boston, who might have looked after him in the Handel and Haydn Society at the time, who might have provided a summer residence, and so on. And I gradually put the thing together, and I wanted the audience of the book, the readers of the book, to kind of share with me the excitement of discovering things that would have made this possible. So I don't hide my research. In historical fiction, generally, you read the story and you don't know how the person found out that this would have been possible. But with Mr. Beethoven, you're kind of in on the act a bit anyway, along the way. So he comes to Boston, he stays with the Lowell Mason family, he goes to Quincy in the summer, and there he meets somebody who will be crucial to the oratorio, because one of the big problems with the oratorio is finding words for it, finding a libretto. And he's helped by somebody when he gets to Quincy, goes ahead, steams ahead, writes the thing, a little unbelievably, I suppose, that he gets through a whole oratorio in a couple of months, but there we are, he does. I think Beethoven could, and he would go for years when he wrote very little. And then there were periods like with the Fifth, Sixth Symphonies and Fourth Piano Concerto and other things, the Passeggiata Sonata, the Razumovsky Quartets, all done in about 18 months. So he was capable of writing very fast as well as taking a long time over pieces. And then, of course, you have to have the oratorio performed. And it's performed in Boston. And we are there along with various other people of the time who might have been there.
So, Paul, when did you first become aware of the proposed commission, and what about it kind of captured your imagination?
Well, I've been trying to find out. I thought it was a footnote in Emily Anderson's collection of the letters. Emily Anderson did a 3-volume collection of Mozart's letters in English translation, and then of Beethoven's letters, which is by far the biggest compilation, I think, available in any language at the time. This is in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And I thought I'd stumbled across a footnote there, but now I can't find it. And maybe Teresa, who made this wonderful documentary about the commission, knows where there is this footnote. But obviously, it was known. There was a newspaper report. It was known to Beethoven scholars that this commission had been proposed in 1823, and Beethoven didn't say no. So why not have him do it?
Excellent. You mentioned earlier your approach to the novel in kind of giving a very candid account of your research methods and all the great pains you took to make sure that what you were writing was maybe not historically accurate, but historically plausible. Why was that so important to you to get it right, but also to bring readers into that process? Well,
I didn't want scholars, which are not at all, I didn't want scholars saying, oh, well, he couldn't have done that because Boston wasn't like that. I wanted to get it as right as I could. And in searching out little details, you find things that are extraordinarily valuable to you in terms of the book. I mean, one example, I chose a music publisher in Boston who could have taken care of drafting the parts. Beethoven would have written a score with the orchestra and the chorus all together. And the orchestra, in order to play it, would have needed to have their parts taken out of the score by copyists. This was standard procedure. So I found a music publisher in Boston at the time who might have been available to do this. And then I discovered that there'd been a fire there in the autumn of 1833, burning down the whole building. So there was an explanation for why we don't have the score of this oratorio. I wanted to have a little scrap of it in the book. I thought there ought to be some music notation in the book. And so I chose a little tune. It's almost like a folk tune out of one of Beethoven's conversation books in 1820. And for maximum authenticity, this is supposed to be sung by a boy treble, boy soprano in the oratorio. So I had a boy, grandson of an old school friend of my wife's, Bobby Baragnani, who very kindly copied out this tune with my words for it, and that is reproduced in the book. So we have a little scrap of the oratorio, but the rest of it was burnt in this fire, if it ever existed.
I noticed that, and you tucked that detail away, and I think the last footnote at the very back of the book is kind of a clever way to include it, nice little Easter egg. One thing I wanted to talk about is how you kind of bring Beethoven, the character, to life, and the methods you used to make him seem authentic. My understanding is that all the dialogue in the book that Beethoven speaks is taken from his real life letters. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. In at least complete clauses and very often complete sentences. So I went through all the letters I could find, the 3 volumes of Emily Anderson that I've already talked about. There are other earlier translations from 19th century and early 20th century. And then I had to, well, there are 2 ways of going about it. You find a nice sentence and you find a way of getting it into the book. Or you're writing a scene for Beethoven and you need him to say something, and then you've got to go all the way through these books trying to find the right thing for him to say. And again, you find wonderful things, like there is a reference in one of the letters. Beethoven makes a reference in one of his letters to Wales. Well, that had me thinking about a writer who would have been sort of 14 at the time, who might possibly have gone from New York to Boston, and oh gosh, here's this chap talking about Wales. So he gets into the book.
I noticed, jumping ahead a little, that when the oratorio premieres in the book, you make it kind of a star-studded occasion. I mean, obviously a lot of people coming out to see Beethoven, but I think I noticed Thoreau is there, and Herman Melville makes an appearance, like you said, and I think a 3-year-old Emily Dickinson is in the crowd, just out of coincidence. What did you learn about early 19th
Margaret Fuller? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people who could have been there, well, they would have. I mean, my goodness, a Beethoven premiere in Boston, which in those days was a relatively small town. You could probably walk across it in a quarter of an hour or something. So of course people would have gone. Of course they would. Why not? So sure, yeah, they're there. And Thoreau was a student at Harvard at the time.
What was your familiarity with kind of the cultural landscape of Boston in that time? Was there anything that surprised you in your research that you discovered?
Gosh, what surprised me? Well, I suppose I was surprised that there were people. I mentioned Margaret Fuller. There were people around who were important in the propagation of Beethoven's music, not only in Boston, but in the whole United States, even in the whole English-speaking world, who could have been there, who could have been there and had their interest in Beethoven sparked off by seeing the great man there. I mean, can you imagine coming all the way from Europe? So yeah, I mean, that was a wonderful thing to find. And then also, I suppose maybe what surprised me most of all was the presence still of the Native American population. That there actually is something. I mean, one important source for me was history of the society, the H&H Society, which I'm sure Teresa can tell us much more about. And it's recorded in there that there were Native Americans who went along. I can't remember whether it was to performance or a rehearsal. So I thought, yeah, let's include that detail and have them going along and seeing what they would make of Beethoven. So yeah,
it's a surprise in the book as well. It's a very powerful chapter. Certainly one of my favorites. Even just doing the research for that, I mean, you had to kind of build out a scene around this very scant piece of information in a note somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I had to also. I mean, this whole thing would have been impossible without the internet. And I wrote this book here in this very room. I am now looking west, not quite to where you are, but the sun is going down over there. But I am 3,000 miles away or something. I could do research here. I could call up maps of Boston in the 1830s, maps of Quincy. I could call up, it's amazing what publications were available even in the 17th century relating to Native American languages. Extraordinary dictionaries, highly detailed. So I could find some words of the language that these people would have spoken. And I have Josiah Quincy having some familiarity with this language. Josiah Quincy III is Beethoven's host in Quincy. Beethoven, every summer, he would leave Vienna. He didn't stay in Vienna during the summer. He would always go to some resort, which is now in the Viennese suburbs. So he has to get out of Boston in the summer. He has to have some summer place to go and stay in. And it's at the home of Josiah Quincy III in Quincy that he stays the summer.
Paul, you talk about all the research you did. One thing you mentioned early in the book is how little information there is about the historical women of the period.
Yes, exactly.
And I think it's interesting that you chose to make two women very pivotal parts of the plot. Mrs. Hill, who I'm fairly certain is a real life person,
Yes.
but also Thankful, who acts as Beethoven's sign language interpreter. Tell me a little bit about why you made that choice, given how challenging it can be to accurately represent, given the lack of information.
Yes, exactly. So, well, I thought Beethoven ought to have some close, warm friendship with a woman in Boston, something he hadn't had it in Vienna. We know that he fell in love when he was in his 20s and 30s with some of his pupils who were aristocrats, so beyond his reach. Marriage with them would have been completely impossible. So I thought that he ought to have some kind of warm connection with a woman of the period. And Mrs. Hill was a cousin of Quincy's. It's perfectly plausible that she would be there as well. I make her a woman with a great deal of education. I mean, she knows German. She is very familiar with musical notation. This is all not at all impossible. Her wretched cousin, Josiah Quincy III, closed down the first school for girls there was in Boston, but she was of a class where she would have had private tutors. So it's by no means impossible. She was a very well-educated woman and could take over the reins from the first librettist, who we'll talk about in a little bit. I'm thankful, yeah. Well, I just talked a little bit about how you find details which, whoops, am I still being heard?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay, right, because it is a bit unstable. I had gone to see my younger son, and we were driving in a car, and he had asked me to tell him about what I was working on. And I said I was working on this book about Beethoven going to Boston. One of the problems was, how's he going to communicate? And my son Rupert said to me, how far is Martha's Vineyard from Boston? I said, it's just around the corner. I think so. So it was. There was hereditary deafness because of some chap from Kent who'd gone to Martha's Vineyard in the 1630s or something. And in the Beethoven period, the time when Beethoven is in Boston, 1833, 10% of the people on Martha's Vineyard were deaf. And so almost everybody knew sign language because this was the only way you could communicate. You were bound to have a friend or a family member who was deaf, and you had to communicate with them. And it was also very useful if you wanted to do secret messages in class or in church or something. You've got a ready silent language. So I thought, well, he's got to have an amanuensis, somebody who comes from Martha's Vineyard to help him. And it seemed to somebody who hadn't got any family responsibilities of her own and could come along and, again, maybe slightly implausible that she manages to teach Beethoven sign language in a couple of weeks or something, but she does. And so as long as she's around and can deliver to him in signs what people are saying, then he can communicate. So that's what happens. She goes around with Beethoven all the way through the book. She doesn't say very much for herself. What she does say is pretty important when it occurs, and she is his means of communication with the rest of the population that he has to communicate with.
It's amazing how much you can learn about real life history when preparing a fictional story.
Exactly, yes.
Teresa, Mr. Beethoven features a number of real life figures from H&H, Lowell Mason, Samuel Richardson, to name a few. As the historian for H&H, what was it like to see this era brought to life on the page?
I thought it was wonderful. Just everything, every character felt absolutely right. All of the details that Paul has just talked about, come together so beautifully. And a couple really struck me when they're performing the oratorio and Jonas Chickering is singing. His part is memorized, but he doesn't show that. He has his score in front of him, which is something that would ring very true because Chickering kind of had that personality. He would be that prepared, but he wouldn't want to show up anybody else, is how he comes across in a lot of the records. Likewise, Lowell Mason, the way Paul, from the very initial greeting, has Mason kind of take control. Mason's the conductor. In the scene where Richardson and Mason and Chickering come to see Beethoven when the oratorio is actually finished, and the description of how Mason positions himself in the room to be able to kind of take control. All of that just, I thought was so well done because each character was so clearly drawn and how they kind of fit within the society, what we know about them, which quite frankly isn't a whole lot, but they really came to life that way. And that was something I thought was just absolutely fantastic.
So Teresa, Paul mentioned earlier, there's a video or explainer about the history behind the Beethoven Commission proposal. In my review for the Globe, I noted that it's a real testament to Beethoven's stature that there's so much interest in something he didn't do. Why was this such an important moment for Haydn Handel? Sorry, Handel.
I think because it was such a young organization at the time, 1822, 1823, H&H wasn't around that long, being founded in 1815. And the idea that they would want to commission a living composer when up until this time they had been primarily performing music of either Handel or Haydn or their contemporaries, I think that set a kind of new standard for the society to make that offer of a commission. And then of course, it's just so enticing. How did it actually get transmitted? Paul, you were talking about the Emily Anderson letters. It might be the Thayer biography that has the footnote about the commission itself.
Right.
Because Thayer was talking with Schindler and stories got promulgated that way as well. But it just this idea that this little organization of, quite frankly, amateur singers would reach out to one of Europe's greatest composers, I think just becomes so enticing as a new chapter for the society, for them thinking that, we're going to commission living composers and take it into a new kind of direction.
So David, was this, what's the history behind the society's efforts to commission new work? Is this something that happens frequently? Is something that the society still does today?
Well, yeah, we have done about a dozen commissions through our history, starting in 1817, I believe, and most recently this past year. We commissioned Jonathan Woody to do a suite based on the themes of Charles Ignatius Sancho, who was a British escaped slave in the 18th century and the first Black published composer of classical music and first Black to vote in parliamentary elections. And I found it personally very, very meaningful that we were able to bring his music to today's audiences. So commissioning is an exciting project each and every time. It would have been great if Ludwig had responded. But I want to say a couple of things about Teresa's point about bringing the characters and personalities alive. I think that also applies to Beethoven. What's really, really great about this book to me, well, several things, but one of them is that you really get a sense of his personality. He's Beethoven, the guy, a man. He's spending the summer in somebody's house south of Boston, writing a composition, and you feel like you sort of get to know him. And I feel like there's many times where we're in the room with him and other characters, and that moment when Paul says, oh, it could have gone this way, or it could have gone this way. You feel like you're part of the creative process. You're part of the fantasy, the flight that we're all on. I found that just really, really exciting. And I thought that Beethoven, the way that we get to know him was kind of different from what I'd imagined. He always had this idea of him being this sort of brusque, iconoclastic, rough guy that doesn't have any friends, but he seems kind of friendly when he comes over to Boston. And the human connections he makes are really touching, I think. And I guess one other thing I want to throw in there is Michael and Paul, the note about Native Americans, that scene where the Native American comes and hears the organ. That is so powerful and so beautifully described and written. I guess in addition to commissions, I also want to say we've done a lot of American premieres. H&H gave the American premiere of Verdi's Requiem. Of course, we did the American premiere of The Messiah in 1818, Christmas Day, the American premiere of Haydn's Creation, the Mozart C minor Mass, Bach's St. Matthew Passion, several Handel oratorios. So I think H&H has this in its DNA, this connection with making this music new for everybody.
Yeah, Paul, I want to echo what David said about really feeling like you get to know Beethoven as a person through the writing. I wonder if you would consider reading a little bit from the book.
Oh, yeah, I want to thank you and David for saying that. I also want to thank Teresa for not ticking me off about how I presented various people. I didn't know actually too much about Chickering. I couldn't find out too much about Chickering, but I'm very, very happy that he accords with what we know from historical fact. Thank you. So thank you all for what you said. Yeah, let me reach for the book. Whoops, sorry. Now I'm going to have to. Sorry, I'm going to have to disappear for a moment.
So yeah, we've asked Paul to read from chapter 28, where you get a real sense of what Beethoven is thinking as he kind of sets out to take on this challenge.
Yeah. I got the book. We're just about, can I show you? We're just about halfway through the book, and he's in Quincy, and he's met Mrs. Hill at a dinner party, and he's waiting for Mrs. Hill to come and see him. He and Thankful have a little cottage some way away from the main house, and she's going to come and see him. The following morning, the great composer was at his desk in the Quincy cottage at first light. Yes, the work had been giving him difficulties, partly on account of Mr. Ballou's text. The original text is by Hosea Ballou, who was a Unitarian preacher of the time in Boston. But also, and more importantly, because he wanted to find a whole new form and voice for the oratorio as a genre. The very name of the institution that had commissioned the piece, the Handel and Haydn Society, advertised exactly the constraint he felt, almost as a cramp in his shoulders. Judas Maccabeus, the creation. These were magnificent achievements, strong steps in the progress of music, and what counted for more, moral examples of humanity in wholesome contract with the divine, and vice versa. The terms of that contract written in song to be read by the soul. But both music and morality could be caught only in motion, in advance, and oratorio of all types of composition most lacked the necessary agility. Its inclination was to stiffen. You felt that in Haydn, you felt it in Handel, you certainly felt it in his own work, Christ on the Mount of Olives. But that was 30 years ago. Now, he believed, after his opera Der Sturm, he was ready to make oratorio too, bend and spring. He felt the sense of what he was after, just a little ahead of him. The problem was how to bring it near or reach out and grasp it. The problem was to know exactly what it was. A work of art had to be beautiful, of course, but beautiful in a new way. It had to be new, but new in a beautiful way. A kind of pincer operation was required to take hold of something that might appear to exist already, fully formed, even sounding, but that would come into existence only very slowly, quarter note by quarter note, in the act of composition. And even that act would have to be newly founded to seize its particular prey. Now, both were nearer, the oratorio and the strategy to achieve it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just think the excitement, you're inside Beethoven's head, understanding as he's grappling with the creative challenges. I just thought that was fantastic. I think, you also, as you said in the book, Paul, this is before the audience would have ever heard Beethoven's Ninth. It wasn't premiered in the US until 1845. So, we can't even imagine a world today where the Ode to Joy doesn't exist, but for them, it didn't yet. And I think he had that, he's right, he has that in mind, I think it's also great, by the way, that you create this entire new era. It's not just the oratorio for Boston. You allude to several other works that he writes during this period, Indian oratorio, etc. So you've created, there's the first, second, third periods of Beethoven, we know, so you've created an entire fourth period. And so thinking about what that music might have been like, when you look at what's changed from period 1 to 2 to 3, must have been very interesting to sort of conceptualize for you.
Oh, sure. I mean, one thing I can't do is write the music. And I wonder if anybody could. This is the problem when the movie is made, of course. Who's going to do the soundtrack? But seriously, yeah, I thought he did have a plan of making an opera of Shakespeare's Tempest. So that's, the reference there was to Der Sturm, the Tempest. So he has done that. He's written his Tempest opera. He's written various other pieces, and then we talk about pieces that are still in the future. I mean, can you imagine Beethoven crossing the Atlantic? He'd never seen the sea, so he's bound to write an ocean symphony when he gets back to Vienna. But yes, I mean, part of the problem, and I suppose it becomes. I tried to make it interesting for the reader that you're trying to hear music that is just slightly out of grasp. You're getting a feel. Oh yeah, it's slightly, but I can't quite grasp it, and I can't quite grasp it. Nobody can quite grasp it. But also, it could have happened. And what interested me in writing this book, we learn history and we think about history as if everything had to happen the way it happened. It could not have been otherwise. Well, it could have been otherwise. There's this theory that every time a quantum event happens, the universe splits in two, and it goes both possible ways. So by now, there are quadrillions upon quadrillions of universes. So there are universes in which Beethoven does go to Boston and writes an oratorio. There are universes in which Beethoven dies in childhood and never writes anything at all. So I was trying to bring this sort of flexibility in history, so that we don't think, well, it had to go this way, so we have to be as we are, so we have to go forward in a certain way. Well, no, I mean, there is a lot more freedom than we may always account for.
It's a really fascinating blend of historical fiction and speculative fiction, kind of taking a different look at the past. Building off of the passage you just read, Beethoven does complete the oratorio, it is performed. How did you as a writer prepare for describing this in print? It comes across very vividly, and what did you do to build your confidence up, I guess, to describe it so thoroughly?
I should explain. I mean, this hasn't exactly been said. I spent a lot of time as a music critic, so I have a long history of trying to put into words what a musical performance was like, and trying to put it into words, not just for the people who were there, so that they can sort of judge against their own experience, but to it interesting for somebody who wasn't there, so that they can form some kind of impression of what that music might have been like. We all know the difficulty of writing about, I think writing about anything is pretty difficult, but writing about music is notoriously difficult. And you have to find some kind of vocabulary. Technical vocabulary is fine up to a point, but once you start talking about, diminished sevenths or something, then you're losing some of your audience. So one has to try and find images, metaphors that will convey what music was like to people who have not heard it. So maybe that experience helped me build this oratorio. And there were things that would have been possible based on the way Beethoven's music was going right at the end. I think particularly the way he was interesting himself in the old modes of church music and folk song, the Aeolian mode, the Dorian mode, the Phrygian mode, all those white note scales that don't start on C. He was beginning to, there's the Song of Thanksgiving in the Lydian mode, which is the white note scale on F in one of the last quartets. So I have him building on that and making a study of Renaissance music, which took these modes as its basic material, and integrating that with the way his music had been going before that. So creating a kind of E flat major that was a little bit different in all kinds of ways from the E flat major of tradition. And I kind of think that's just about plausible. And then try and get people to think about that and try to stretch their ears and their oral brains to imagine it.
Paul, you actually contributed work to Beethoven's 250th birthday celebrations back in 2020. I did. Is that right?
Yes. Sorry, I've lost you again. Yeah. Shall I say a little bit about that?
Yeah, please.
Well, this is kind of my third. Mr. Beethoven is sort of the third Beethoven project, because I was contacted by Kent Nagano, I don't know, about 15 years ago, who wanted to do a performance. He was leading the Montreal Orchestra, and he wanted to do a performance of Beethoven's Egmont music, which is a fabulous score, far too little known. It has beautiful, beautiful orchestral interludes, which very, very rarely get performed. He wanted to do this whole score, but set aside the Goethe text. Beethoven wrote this music for Goethe's play, Egmont, which is about a sort of libertarian hero, revolutionary hero. And he'd asked people in Montreal, well, is there a Canadian hero we could center our performance of Egmont around? Leave the Goethe play aside and make this about some other hero. And the name that was given him was that of Romeo Dallaire, who had been in charge of the UN so-called peacekeeping mission in Rwanda at the time of the horrible genocide in the 1990s. So there was the Beethoven score, which is highly optimistic and progressive, and things are going to, liberty is going to win out. All these beliefs that Beethoven had, he was a teenager at the time of the French Revolution, 1789. So this was really in his blood, this feeling that the world was heading forward and it was going to be much better for everybody. To put that alongside the Rwanda story. So that was the task. And I did it in 2007. And then there was a performance that in Bonn, in Beethoven's birthplace, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, well, we'd like to have a new piece made just for us for 2020, for the Beethoven 25th anniversary year. Bonn was planning a whole year of celebrations from the notional birthday, December the 16th, 2019, up to December the 16th, 2020. Well, of course, that was almost all cancelled. But the piece they wanted from me, they were going to do at the start, December the 16th, 2019, and that went ahead. And so I chose various items, again, things that are seldom heard, and put together a little 40-minute piece involving these pieces and text spoken by an actor. And that was indeed done in 2019 to start their Beethoven celebrations. I mean, it's kind of, we have a kind of second chance at all this, because 2027 is going to be the 200th anniversary of Beethoven's death. So everything that didn't happen in 2020, we can put forward, it's only 5 years away, we can put forward to 2027.
Excellent. And I think one last question maybe before we head to questions. David, how did HNH celebrate the 250th?
Well, funny story. 2020 was a tough year to do concerts, as Paul mentioned. So we actually began the year in February of 2020 with an old Beethoven chamber concert at First Church in Cambridge. That was kind of our getting the Beethoven year started celebration of the birthday. Of course, then, as we all know, a month later in March, things were shut down. But when things started to come back, and we chose our first concert to sort of celebrate the return of live performing arts, we chose to do a free performance of Beethoven's Ninth at the Hatch Shell, just for the community, because we felt there was nothing else like it for that moment, you know, the Ode to Joy celebration. So we did an audience of 10,000 plus, welcome back the performing arts of Beethoven's Ninth, and we premiered at that a new text to the Ode to Joy by Tracy K. Smith, the former poet laureate of the US, who now lives in Boston. So that's, and then now that we come back, we've done, we just, this couple weeks ago, we did Beethoven's Seventh, which just was launched online last night, the 6th in November. So the return to the stage is very much Beethoven's intertwined with it completely. I want to just say one more thing about the book and the process, Paul, before we go to questions. I see we have one really great question here I want to get to right away. I just to say, I know you said at the beginning of this discussion, I still find it absolutely impossible to believe that you did not come to Boston to research and write that book. It is so such a rich understanding, it seems to me, or rich depiction of the city at that time and life at that time, that I was sure you came here for a couple of weeks to sort of get the sense of the place. Are you saying have you been to Boston?
Oh yeah, I've been to Boston several times.
Okay,
and
right.
I did actually, there was something else that I was involved with, a piece that the Boston Symphony did in, I think, 2015, 2016, while I was writing the book. I should say, I got the idea for this thing somewhere before that. I had no, I wasn't thinking about 2020 as a Beethoven year. That sort of didn't occur to me. But I was in Boston and I thought, okay, I've got to visit the place as well. I knew the Lowell Masons lived in Myrtle Street, on Myrtle Street. So I walked up there, and some of the houses, not their house, but some of the houses are as they would have been in 1833. So I looked up and down there, and I walked down to the harbor, and I stood where the ship would have come in, Lewis Wharf. Yeah, so I did, and I think I say in the book, you know, what these places are like now sometimes. Yes, I did do that. So it's not entirely accidental that there's a bit of Boston feeling in there, I hope. Yeah.
Great. Michael, do you want to move to the questions, or should I do that?
Sure, yeah, happy to do it.
Okay.
So we have a couple questions from viewers in the audience. Feel free to submit more. Looking through them, Paul,
Yeah.
Did you use any H Society archives or records in using the book? Was there any contact between you and H&H before you embarked on this?
No, there wasn't. But yes, there is stuff published. I talked about this history, very detailed history of the society, which was very important. It gave me names of people who were officers of the society, Samuel Richardson, Lowell Mason. It gave me names of singers who were involved in society performances regularly. Marcus Coburn, sort of tenor soloist, and some women singers, Mrs. Long, and so on. And they never had their first name, so you don't know exactly how they fitted into the picture. So yeah, I tried to get as many real people into the book as possible and use those archives. Yeah, and all about Boylston Hall, where they gave their performances. Yes, so that was very important. But I didn't have any contact with the present day society, no, nor did they know I was digging about in the electronic archives.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the audience about your style. Are there elements in the book that you feel are kind of new literary inventions in terms of how you integrated lyrics and musical notation in the text?
Yeah, well, one thing this book does is it's sort of, it's a little bit like a kaleidoscope, that suddenly there's a turn of the kaleidoscope and you're off in a different direction. Like there are chapters which are kind of straight, I'm going to say straight musicology. It's sort of chord musicology. It's not entirely straight-faced, but there are interruptions, musicologists who are talking about this work, so that we get the impression that it really does exist in the present time. We get different views of it, and we get different takes on it. And we hear from some of the participants. We hear from Josiah Quincy directly. We hear from Hannah Hill directly. They come forward. It's like, to give a very highfalutin example, which I don't deserve at all, it's like in a Shakespeare play when a character comes forward and gives a monologue, and then the action continues. So that happens. Yeah, and this was an idea I thought I got from Beethoven. I thought this happened in one of his letters, that he used notation of dynamics, of loudness, of volume, mezzo forte, fortissimo, and so on, to enforce his points. And so I had a little dialogue between Beethoven and Hannah Hill, his librettist, when there's been a misunderstanding between them, and he's very irritated. He's the Beethoven that David was talking about, of being irritable and grumpy and not getting on with people. And so he's vociferating and fortissimo and agitato and so on, and she's trying to calm him down with espressivo and PP, and that was something that just occurred to me as a nice thing to put into that little dialogue, to express two voices opposed to each other and eventually finding some resolution.
Yeah, it was a very fun chapter, absolutely. Another audience member wants to know, through your research, or have you been inspired to write any other books related to H&H history? Maybe a book about Sandro?
No, I hadn't. I had. You know, you have limited time, and writing a book like this takes a while. And gosh, no, I hadn't thought of that. But I don't need too many more projects. Just thanks very much. It's a
I'm
nice
curious,
idea.
Paul, what did you learn about H&H in this process that surprised you, if anything, or that you didn't know?
Oh, I think it is the Native Americans coming in, and then the awareness you get from the history that this was, as I think Teresa said, it was a an amateur society. It was, not to mince matters, it was a gentleman's society. You couldn't be a member if you weren't a man at this point. It was a kind of club. It was a gentleman's club. I mean, you had to be a gentleman too, I think. And it was white, of course. It was exclusively white. So it was the idea of this outfit in what was, in world terms, a pretty small city, having the chutzpah to go to Beethoven and say, we'd like you to write something for us. And this seemed to me, I mean, one thing, I've lived quite a bit in the States and of course on this side of the Atlantic. So it seemed to me a very American thing to do. I don't think, I can't imagine a society in Cardiff, say, to give what would have been a comparable city here in Wales at the time, in the early 19th century. They would never have thought, they would have thought they weren't worthy. They would just never have thought that they could approach Beethoven. But in America, yeah, this was possible. And that's something Beethoven notices in going to America. There's a difference between the two societies. Of course, he's lived in monarchies. He's got a revolutionary spirit inside him, but he's lived his whole life either under the Elector in Bonn or under the Emperor in Vienna. And he comes to a society which is run on completely different lines.
I think we have time for one last question. Paul, what's your next project? Any plans to write a similar book about another artist?
Well, I'm always working on something. And I have a novel that came out in this country after this, but there was a crazy idea I had, I don't know how many more minutes we've got, to write a book that used a very small vocabulary. And the small vocabulary that I ended up choosing was out of Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet. So I wrote a whole novel in Ophelia's voice, where she is only using the words she uses in the play, which is under 500, a very, very small number of words. And I wrote this novel about 15 years ago. It took me a long time to write. And I thought, well, that's it, I can't do anymore. And now I am doing another one of those.
Sounds like you like a challenge.
Yeah. So, well, the trouble, you get an idea. It doesn't take very long to get an idea. I'm sure this is true in all walks of life. You get an idea, and then you have to do it. You have to do it because you've got this idea. You have to realize it, because it's, as long as it stays an idea, it's nothing. You just have to go ahead and do it. And whether it's writing a book that might take you 2 years or building a company that might take you even longer, you just have to do it. So yeah, you get ideas and you have to do it.
Excellent.
Sounds like something Beethoven might have said.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And again,
well, I hope in your spare time you get to learn a little bit more about what HNH is up to these days, because we've come a long way since 18.
Oh, I have no doubt. And I have been to H&H performances in the past, so have no fear. And will in the
Fabulous.
future.
Well, yeah, let us know when you're in town again. I really appreciate your time today, Michael, Teresa. It's been wonderful discussion. I hope the audience has enjoyed it. Please, the book available on our website or your favorite bookseller. Of course, handelnheiden.org, news about our upcoming concerts, and all our website, or rather our app, HNH Plays On, has all of our videos this year. You can enjoy all our concerts. Thank you guys very much. Thank you for joining, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.